I drove 8 hours straight, gripping the wheel tighter with every mile, my heart bouncing between nerves and hope. My name's Lena, and this wasn't just a road trip. It was a love letter written in silence, across distance and years of emotional gaps I never quite understood. I hadn't seen my dad in over a year, but today I was going to change that. The air smelled like cold pine and highway dust. I hadn't even stopped for coffee. I just wanted to get there. Every mile closer felt like I was peeling back layers of myself. I imagined his face when I showed up at the door. "Surprise, Dad. I paid off your mortgage. $72,000. Gone. Cleared. All because I wanted him to feel seen, supported, loved." I had worked 2 jobs for nearly a year and dipped into savings I'd built for my freelance design business. I never told him. He wouldn't have accepted it if I did, at least not for me. But this wasn't about his pride. It was about finally showing him that I was still here, still trying. The dashboard clock blinked just after 5 p.m. as I turned off the highway and into the neighborhood I grew up in. Familiar trees, familiar sidewalks, but still unfamiliar warmth. I parked a block away so he wouldn't hear the car. I checked my face in the rearview mirror. My eyes were puffy. I hadn't slept. But my smile? It was there. Shaky, but there. I grabbed the envelope from the glove compartment. The mortgage release papers. I had even wrapped them in a little ribbon like a gift. My hands were trembling now. This wasn't just about Thanksgiving. This was me showing up, not just to dinner, but for him. For us. As I walked up the front steps, I whispered, "Please let this be a good day." I rang the doorbell, and I had no idea that within the next 60 seconds, the man I loved more than anything would look me straight in the face and call the police on me. When the officer asked me to step off the porch that night, I wasn't surprised. Not really. I mean, somewhere deep inside, a part of me always expected this kind of rejection, because that house, his house, had never felt like home to me. I grew up in its shadow, not inside its warmth. From as early as I can remember, I was always too much or not enough. Too emotional, not obedient enough. Too ambitious, not quiet like my brother Jacob. He could do no wrong in my father's eyes. If he skipped school, it was boys being boys. If I got an A-, it was, why didn't he get an A+? The difference in how we were treated wasn't subtle, it was soul-crushing. Birthdays, holidays, even ordinary dinners. Jacob always got the best seat, the bigger slice, the last word. I learned to sit still, to shrink. I learned that silence was safer than asking for love. Still, I tried. I joined his favorite sports team's fan club just to have something to talk about with him. I volunteered to mow the lawn even though I had asthma. I brought home art trophies and honor roll certificates just hoping he'd pin one to the fridge. He never did, and yet every time he walked by without noticing, I tried again. Because that's what daughters do, right? We keep reaching, even when the hands never reach back. When Mom died, it only got worse. The little warmth she brought into the house vanished. Dad grew colder. Jacob moved out, but somehow he still got daily calls, Sunday dinners, and side jokes. I got check-ins only when bills were due or favors were needed. And despite it all, I never stopped loving him. That night, standing outside the house I spent my entire childhood trying to belong in, I realized I had driven 8 hours hoping for a moment I'd been chasing for 28 years. I didn't come here to be thanked. I came here to finally feel like I mattered. And instead, I was being asked to leave. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same. Gray siding, chipped paint on the porch railings, and that crooked mailbox I offered to fix when I was 17. He told me to leave it alone then, said it works fine, like everything else in this family that was just barely hanging on. I sat in the car for a moment, clutching the folder in my lap, the one that held the bank letter, the official notice that his $72,000 mortgage was now paid in full. Paid by me. I imagined the moment. He'd open the door, stunned, maybe speechless. His eyes would well up. A hug, a thank you, maybe even, I'm proud of you. I knocked, heart racing. He opened the door and his face dropped. No joy, no surprise, just annoyance, discomfort. He didn't even step outside. What are you doing here, Lena? I came to surprise you. For Thanksgiving. I thought it might be nice to. I told you not to come uninvited. I tried to smile, holding out the folder like some kind of peace treaty. Dad, I paid off your mortgage. The house, it's yours, free and clear. I just wanted to. He didn't even look at the papers. Lena, he said, backing away like I was contagious. You don't get to show up and act like family because you threw money at me. My throat closed up. It's not about money. It's about making things right. He shook his head. You're always trying to prove something. It's exhausting. I glanced over his shoulder, hoping maybe Jacob was there. Maybe he'd step in. But the house was quiet. Dad, please. He cut me off, pulling out his phone. You need to leave. Wait, what are you? I'm calling the police. I thought he was bluffing, until I heard him say, yeah, I have someone trespassing. I'd like them removed. Now. Then, like a dagger, his last words. Surprises are for people who belong here. She doesn't. I didn't cry. Not right then. I just stepped back down the porch stairs, my body moving on autopilot. Minutes later, headlights approached. The officer asked me questions I barely registered. I handed him the folder. He read it, looked up at me, and then back at the house. He's your father? He asked gently. I nodded. You paid off his mortgage? Another nod. He sighed. He doesn't want you here. I'm sorry. I wasn't angry. Just hello. I got in my car. I didn't say goodbye. And as I drove away from the house that never welcomed me, I said nothing at all. But that night, in the silence of my apartment, I pressed one button and started something none of them saw coming. The drive back was darker than the one that brought me there. Maybe because this time I wasn't carrying hope. I didn't play music. I didn't call anyone. I just drove, mile after mile, hands clenched around the steering wheel, eyes fixed ahead, blinking back the tears that kept threatening to spill. It wasn't just the rejection. It was the finality of it. That house wasn't just where my dad lived. It was where I kept the illusion that I still had place to return to. I remembered the Thanksgiving dinners when I was younger, how I'd offer to help set the table, only for my stepmother to hand the duty to Jacob instead. How they'd always carve out Jacob's favorite dish, but never mine. When I turned 13, I made an entire pumpkin pie myself, hoping to contribute. No one touched it. It sat on the counter like a forgotten object, while they praised Jacob for microwaving mashed potatoes. I thought maybe I hadn't done enough, so I kept trying. I stayed in school, got scholarships, worked 3 jobs during college. I never asked him for a single dime. Not when I couldn't afford books, not when I skipped meals to save for rent. But every few months, I'd still send a card, a birthday message, a thinking of you text that usually went unanswered. Even when I moved to another state, when I started making real money, when I finally bought my own place, I still told myself that one day I'd be worthy. That one day I'd be enough for him to say, I'm glad you're mine. But now, driving through the silence, I knew. I had never been part of that family. Not really. They didn't forget to include me. They chose not to, because to them, I was a reminder of the marriage that didn't work out, of the daughter that didn't match their picture-perfect mold. I thought paying off the mortgage would fix that. I thought removing his burden would earn me a seat at the table. But all it did was remind him that I had succeeded without him, that I didn't need him. And maybe that was the problem all along. My existence didn't make him proud. It made him uncomfortable. When I finally got home, I walked in and didn't even bother turning on the lights. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the folder still in my hands, and I placed it on the counter like it was something toxic. The silence in my apartment was deafening, but it said everything I needed to hear. It told me the begging was over. The proving was over. He'd made his choice, and now it was time I made mine. That night, I didn't cry, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I was finally done giving them the power to make me feel small. And as I stared at the ceiling above my bed, eyes wide open, I knew the next time they saw my name, it wouldn't be in a text message. It would be on a letterhead, on paperwork, on consequences, because I wasn't the outsider anymore. I was the storm they didn't see coming. Back in my apartment, the world felt quieter, but not in an empty way. It was the kind of silence that signals something shifting inside you, the kind that comes right before a storm breaks open. I kicked off my shoes, set my keys down, and sat in front of my laptop. The glow of the screen reflected in my eyes, but my heart was what lit up. I hovered over one single button, Launch Company Site. That was it. That was the button I had mentioned when I left my father's driveway without saying a word. That was the moment everything would change. I clicked, and with that click, my real estate startup, Hollow Oak Properties, was officially live. Not a concept, not a draft, not a dream. A real company. Mine. I had been building it in silence for months. Late nights, long weekends, empty coffee cups. And funding it with a combination of my own savings and a secret inheritance that not even my father knew existed. Money from my late grandfather's will, hidden and quietly allocated to me, bypassing my dad altogether. Funny, isn't it? The man who shut the door in my face and called the cops on me that Thanksgiving didn't realize I had already been written into a legacy he thought was his to control. My grandfather, before passing, left behind a personal letter, one that said, "Lena, I see the fight in you. I see the grace. This is your seed. Make something they can't ignore." At the time, I didn't even know how to process that. It was surreal. I remember reading it with shaking hands, staring at the financial documents like they couldn't possibly be meant for me. But they were. And I didn't waste it. I poured every cent into something that would stand tall, taller than their opinions, louder than their judgment. A real estate company with a soul. One that didn't just buy and sell, but built homes for people like me. People looking for belonging. I partnered with architects, interior designers, and former foster kids who had made something of themselves. Every element of my startup was rooted in something personal, something that told a story. And the first batch of listings, they were in the very neighborhood my dad prided himself on owning. Poetic, huh? As the site went live, I watched the analytics begin to tick. A few clicks, then a few more. My phone buzzed with a message from my attorney. Press release ready to distribute Monday. I typed back one word, send. Because this time, I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval. I wasn't checking for a reply. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the power I had always begged someone else to give me. Only now I'd built it myself. I leaned back in my chair, finally letting the tears fall, not from pain but from relief. The kind of release you only feel when you've held your breath for years, and finally exhale. They thought they shut me out. They had no idea I had built my own front door. And tonight, I didn't need anyone to invite me in. I was already home. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my phone buzzed with a message from my legal team. Title confirmed. Property lien is officially in your name. I stared at the screen, letting that sentence soak in. I already knew it was coming. It was part of a long, silent process I had set in motion months ago, but seeing it in writing hit different. My father's house, the same house where I stood on Thanksgiving with a gift of peace in my hand and got the cops called on me, was now tangled in debt. And I was the one holding the strings. Here's what happened. After I launched Hollow Oak Properties, my team expanded fast. We began acquiring distressed properties and bundled liens through quiet acquisitions. Most of it was handled by lawyers and finance pros who knew the ins and outs of these loopholes like gospel. But one file landed on my desk that made my hands go still. A heavily mortgaged house on Oak Ridge Lane. My father's address. I looked at the report again and again, thinking there had to be a mistake. But there it was, 3 existing liens stacked due to unpaid property taxes, an unresolved contractor dispute, and some shady refinancing he clearly hadn't understood. The debt was scattered across 2 firms, both of which I now had partial ownership in. This wasn't some revenge plot I had mapped out. It found me, and when it did, I didn't walk away. I took the file, signed the authorization, and quietly made the purchases to consolidate everything under one name. Mine. I didn't even feel triumphant. I felt quiet, focused. This wasn't about power. It was about balance. And balance always finds its way back, one way or another. A week later, the first letter went out to him. Formal notice that the debt holder was now Hollow Oak Recovery Division. We gave him options, like we did with all clients. A fair payment plan, an offer to sell and clear the slate, or default. I didn't get involved directly. Until he did. I was in the middle of reviewing floor plans when my assistant buzzed in, slightly stunned. There's a Mr. Thompson on line 2. He says he's your father. My stomach turned, but my voice stayed calm. Put him through. There was a pause, and then his voice came through, tight and desperate. Lena, I got these letters. This can't be real. Tell me this is some mistake. I took a breath. It's not a mistake, Dad. Silence. Then anger. You can't do this to me. This is my house. I built this. You're my daughter. That word, daughter, cut sharp. You told me I didn't belong, I said softly. Now, I'm just following your lead. He was silent again, and this time it lingered. You're gonna take my house? He asked, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I didn't answer with cruelty, just truth. I'm offering you the same options we give everyone. No better, no worse. What you decide next is on you. That was it. He hung up. I didn't hear from him again for weeks, but I heard from his lawyer, a formal request to renegotiate terms. I reviewed the file carefully, twice. Then I approved a slightly better offer, not because he was my father, but because that's how Hollow Oak does business, even with those who once locked us out. It started with my brother's call. I hadn't heard his voice in nearly a year, not since the Thanksgiving disaster. Back then, he stood behind Dad with folded arms and a smirk like I had no place there. Now he sounded frantic. Lena, listen. We didn't know. About the liens. About whatever it is you're doing. I sat in my office, calm, legs crossed, fingers lightly tapping my desk. It's called asset consolidation, Josh, I replied. And it's perfectly legal. You can ask your lawyer. I believe Dad already did. There was a pause on the other end. You can't seriously be taking the house. I could hear the panic buried in his tone. And beneath that, entitlement. You mean the house I was kicked out of? The one I wasn't allowed to visit, even after paying off a $72,000 mortgage. No one asked me to. That was Dad being Dad, he stammered. You know how he gets. He didn't mean. He meant every word, I said, my voice steady. And now I do too. He fell silent again. Hours later, my dad called. I didn't answer. He called again the next morning. Then came a text. We need to talk. Please. I gave it 2 days before replying. When I finally picked up, his voice wasn't angry. It was tired, tense, defeated. Lena, what do you want? He asked. It wasn't a warm question. It was transactional, desperate. I leaned back, staring out the window of my office at the skyline I'd earned, every inch of it from grit and solitude. I want respect, I said. Not just from you, but from myself. And to stop pretending like I'm chasing people who never wanted me to catch up. He let out a breath. So, you're taking the house? No, I've already taken it. Another silence. But I'm not evicting you. Not unless you make me. There it was. My boundary. Not a sword, but a line in the sand. I'm offering a lease, I added. A fair one. Market rate. With a clause. No more police, no more cold shoulders. You treat me like a stranger. You'll stay one. He didn't respond for a long time. And when he did, it wasn't the fury I expected. It was something more devastating. Your grandfather left you that money, didn't he? I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. He did. Quietly. Because he saw what you didn't. He cleared his throat. You've built something, haven't you? I have. And you're not doing this out of spite? I took a breath. No, I'm doing it because I spent too long begging for a seat at your table. Now I own the table, and I decide who eats. The next week, legal documents were signed. Ownership was official. The lease agreement was mailed, and to my surprise, signed and returned without edits. They stayed, quietly, respectfully. But the house? It didn't feel like theirs anymore. It felt like mine. And as I walked through those familiar rooms one evening, checking on a minor repair, I didn't feel like a guest. I felt like someone who had finally returned home, on her own terms, not because they let me in, but because I built the door myself. This time the drive was different. No nervous heartbeats. No shaky hands gripping the steering wheel. No desperate hope waiting at the end of the road. This time I was heading home. Not the cold, stiff house I grew up in, where love was rationed and presents came with conditions, but the place I built with my own hands, heart, and unbreakable will. A home that didn't require anyone else's permission to feel safe. I bought it 3 months after the dust settled, the legal battles, the signatures, the final phone call from my father, who now understood silence as my language of survival. He still lived in that old house under my lease, paying rent on time, keeping quiet. And I had walked away, not in anger, but in full peace, because I had everything I needed now. My new home sat on a quiet hillside, warm and filled with light. Hardwood floors I picked out myself. A big kitchen where I could cook the meals I loved. And a long table, not for proving anything to anyone, but for gathering those who saw me, loved me, chose me. People who didn't measure my worth in old grudges or fading titles. That first Thanksgiving, I set the table with gold-trimmed plates and linen napkins. My best friend, Nora, brought the turkey. My co-founder, Sam, brought wine. My assistant, who I insisted treat the day as family time, showed up with her mother, who hugged me like I was her own. Even my old neighbor, Mrs. Langley, came over with her famous sweet potato casserole. There were toasts, laughter, full plates and fuller hearts. And not once did I feel like I had to earn my seat at that table. No one looked at me like I didn't belong. No one questioned my presence. No one called the police. As we sat around that table, I looked at the deed framed on the wall. My name, my signature, no one else's. And it hit me, not just the weight of what I had reclaimed, but the beauty of what I had created. Because home isn't where you're told you belong. Home is where you build belonging. And this was mine.